The chandeliers of the Harrington ballroom blazed like captive constellations, scattering fractured light across polished marble and silk-clad shoulders, as though heaven itself had descended to witness a spectacle. Carriages had been arriving since dusk, wheels crunching over frost-hardened gravel, bearing London's most vigilant arbiters of worth. Beneath the golden glow, reputations were minted or marred with a glance, and alliances were sealed with a turn about the dance floor. On this winter evening, however, it was not triumph but humiliation that hovered in the perfumed air, subtle as powder and twice as suffocating. Miss Eleanor Whitcombe stood near the edge of the room, her gloved hands folded with deliberate composure against the pale blue silk of her gown. The fabric, though expertly altered, betrayed the careful economy of a family once affluent and now diminished. She carried herself with unassailable grace, chin lifted, shoulders aligned, as though the whispers brushing past her were merely draughts from an open window. Yet her stillness was not ignorance, it was discipline. She had been reared to understand that dignity, once fractured, was seldom restored. Once, the Whitcombe name had opened doors without hesitation. Her father, a barrister of honorable standing, had possessed both wit and means. But a failed investment, too bold, too trusting, had dissolved fortune into debt and admiration into pity. Society, which loved a rising star, found little romance in decline. Eleanor knew this. She felt it in the altered tone of invitations, in the measured politeness of matrons who had once kissed her cheek with unfeigned warmth. Tonight's ball was less an honor than a test of endurance. Across the room stood Mr. Adrian Carlisle, heir to a formidable industrial empire whose smokestacks marked the horizon like monuments to progress. He was not merely wealthy, he was inevitable. Tall and immaculately tailored, with dark hair disciplined as his temperament, he commanded attention without seeking it. Conversations recalibrated when he approached. Mothers angled their daughters toward his orbit. He carried the confidence of a man accustomed to acquisition, of contracts, of influence, of futures. Rumor had embroidered his presence with particular interest. It was said he would soon declare himself engaged to Miss Margaret Densmore, whose lineage was as unblemished as her fortune. The match was sensible, admired, nearly ordained. That Eleanor and Adrian had once shared lively discourse at musicales and charity committees was remembered by some with indulgent amusement. The past, in London, was tolerated only if it did not interfere with profitable arrangements. Eleanor felt his gaze before she saw him. It was not tender, nor was it cruel, it was assessing as though she were a ledger he had not yet balanced. For a suspended instant their eyes met. Something unspoken flickered there, recognition, perhaps, or the faint ache of what might have been permitted under kinder circumstances. She inclined her head with restrained civility. He returned the gesture, equally composed. Around them violins swelled. A cluster of young gentlemen nearby spoke in tones insufficiently hushed. "It is whispered," one remarked, "that Miss Whitcombe entertains hopes of securing Carlisle before the Densmores secure him first." A ripple of laughter followed, delicate and poisonous. Eleanor did not turn. She would not grant the insult movement. But heat rose beneath her collar, and her pulse beat an unsteady rhythm against the stays of her bodice. Adrian heard them. Whether from pride or impatience, he crossed the polished expanse toward the offending circle. The music softened as dancers changed partners. He offered a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "ambition is a commendable trait. Yet one must choose a wife with care." A pause, weighted and deliberate. A wife must elevate a man's standing, not burden it. Miss Whitcombe, I fear, would struggle in such a role. The words did not ring. They settled, heavy as iron, into the marrow of the room. A fan slipped from a lady's grasp. The violins faltered before recovering their tempo. Eleanor felt as though the floor had tilted, though her posture remained immaculate. For a breathless heartbeat she stared at him, not pleading, not accusing, simply absorbing. The cruelty was not in volume but in calculation. He had chosen clarity over kindness. Color drained from her cheeks, yet her voice, when it emerged, was steady. "Your concern for elevation does you credit, Mr. Carlisle," she replied softly. "I should not wish to impede any gentleman's ascent." A faint curtsy followed, executed with precision that bordered on defiance. She turned before her composure could fracture, weaving through the crowd with measured grace. The murmur she left behind swelled, then fragmented into speculation. Adrian remained motionless. Triumph had not accompanied his declaration. Instead, a curious hollowness spread within him. He had meant to silence gossip, to assert control. Yet as the ballroom resumed its glittering rhythm, He found himself watching the retreating blue of her gown as though something irretrievable had slipped beyond reach. He had defended his prospects, preserved his advantage. Why then did the victory taste of ash? Outside, the night air struck Eleanor's lungs with bracing severity. Her carriage awaited, lamplight trembling against the lacquered door. She did not weep as she entered. Tears were indulgences reserved for privacy. Instead, she pressed her gloved hands together and fixed her gaze upon the darkened street ahead. Behind her, music and laughter spilled from the open doors like a reminder of a world recalibrating itself without her consent. Above the balcony, Adrian stepped into the cold, drawn by an impulse he could not name. He saw the carriage begin to move, wheels carving shallow crescents in the frost. For the first time that evening, uncertainty pierced his practiced composure. He had spoken as society required, as ambition dictated. Yet as the distance widened between them, an unfamiliar thought unsettled him with quiet insistence, that in safeguarding his ascent, he may have cast aside the one woman whose absence would diminish him beyond measure. Morning in London arrived with a brittle brightness, the frost along the Whitcombe windows catching the light like fractured crystal, yet within the modest drawing-room the air felt close, saturated with yesterday's humiliation. Eleanor sat upright at the escritoire, pen poised above correspondence she could not quite compose, aware that silence from society would wound more deeply than gossip. No invitations had arrived with the post. Only bills and a discreet reminder from her father's solicitor lay stacked beside her elbow. Reputation, she understood now, was a currency as tangible as coin, and she had been publicly declared bankrupt. Across the city, Adrian Carlisle reviewed factory ledgers without seeing their columns. The efficiency that had always steadied him faltered beneath an intrusive memory, the controlled cadence of Eleanor's reply, the precision of her curtsy, the quiet blaze in her eyes. He had expected tears or reproach, something to justify his cold pronouncement. Instead, she had met his cruelty with composure, rendering him the lesser figure in a room determined to applaud him. Pride had shielded him in the moment, reflection stripped that shield to its fragile framework. By noon, London's drawing-rooms hummed with embellished versions of the scene. It was said that Miss Whitcombe had reached beyond her station, that Mr. Carlisle had gallantly corrected presumption. Eleanor overheard fragments of this narrative at the grocer's, where conversation halted with conspicuous courtesy as she entered. She selected her provisions with measured calm, refusing to rush, for haste would confirm weakness. Yet each sidelong glance pressed against her ribs like a tightening band. That afternoon, a parcel arrived at the Whitcombe residence, delivered by a uniformed footman whose livery bore no crest. Inside lay a bouquet of winter camellias, white as unmarked snow, their petals firm and luminous despite the season's severity. Nestled among the stems rested a card bearing a single line in decisive script: "Dignity shines brightest when tested." Eleanor traced the ink with her gaze, recognizing the controlled hand without needing a signature. The flowers were exquisite, chosen with care. They were also dangerous. Her father entered as she stood contemplating them, hope flickering across his worn features before he discerned her expression. "From whom?" he asked gently. She did not answer directly. "From a gentleman newly attentive to appearances," she replied, voice steady but distant. He understood enough. Their fortunes could not endure fresh scandal, nor could her spirit survive further spectacle. Without flourish, she wrapped the camellias once more in their tissue and instructed the maid to return them untouched. When the bouquet was set back upon his own desk later that evening, Adrian regarded it as though it were a rebuke in botanical form. He had meant the gesture as quiet atonement, something to acknowledge without inflaming rumor. Its return exposed the insufficiency of half measures. He realized with unwelcome clarity that apology, to be worthy, must risk the very standing he had sought to preserve. The thought unsettled him. Risk was calculated in industry, but in matters of the heart he had invested only caution. 2 evenings later, a charity auction convened beneath vaulted ceilings fragrant with beeswax and ambition. Eleanor attended at her father's urging, for absence would concede defeat. She wore the same pale blue gown, altered once more to suggest renewal rather than repetition. Conversations thinned as she entered, yet she moved through the room with unhurried grace, pausing before a landscape painting whose muted horizon seemed to promise endurance beyond present storms. Adrian observed her from across the hall, noting the subtle defiance in her posture. When bidding commenced for the landscape, he lifted his paddle with measured resolve. The price ascended rapidly, murmurs rising with it, until even seasoned collectors withdrew. He did not hesitate. The final sum fell like a gauntlet upon the floor. Gasps threaded through the crowd as the auctioneer declared him victor. Then, with deliberate clarity, Adrian addressed the assembly. "In honor of Miss Whitcombe's discernment," he said, his voice resonant yet controlled, "I request that this painting be recorded as her contribution to tonight's cause." Silence followed, dense and electric. The gesture was public, undeniable, and fraught. Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze converge upon her. He had returned to the field of scrutiny, this time positioning himself at her side rather than above her. Heat rose to her cheeks, not of shame but of anger tempered by restraint. She inclined her head in acknowledgment yet did not smile. Charity bestowed without consent could resemble patronage. Admiration proclaimed in public could invite harsher whispers. As applause reluctantly gathered, she stepped toward him. "Your generosity is formidable, Mr. Carlisle," she said quietly, ensuring only he could hear. "But dignity is not restored by spectacle." The words were neither cruel nor tender, they were true. He met her gaze, something unguarded stirring beneath his composure. "Then instruct me," he replied equally subdued, "for I would not misstep again." The admission, though slight, altered the air between them. For the first time since the ballroom, he spoke without armor. Yet around them, speculation coiled anew, sharper for having tasted controversy. Before Eleanor could answer, a bright voice carried across the hall. Miss Margaret Densmore, radiant in crimson silk, approached with triumphant poise. "How fortunate we are," she declared, slipping her arm through Adrian's, "that my future husband is so benevolent." The word future rang like a bell. Eleanor's breath stilled. Adrian's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The crowd leaned closer, hungry for confirmation. In that suspended moment, Eleanor understood that the battle for her dignity was no longer whispered but publicly entwined with a claim that threatened to render her defiance irrelevant, unless he chose at last to speak. Rain swept across London in slanting silver sheets, blurring the gas lamps into trembling halos and turning cobblestones slick as polished obsidian. Within the charitable infirmary off Bishopsgate, the air smelled of starch, carbolic, and human frailty. Eleanor Whitcombe moved between narrow beds with composed efficiency, her sleeves pinned neatly above her wrists, her pale gown concealed beneath a plain apron. Here, titles dissolved into need and whispers could not follow. She preferred the honest gravity of suffering to the ornamental cruelty of ballrooms. Yet even in this sanctuary the echo of Miss Densmore's declaration pursued her. "My future husband." The words had not been corrected. Adrian's silence had struck more sharply than his earlier insult, for it suggested acquiescence. Eleanor had returned home from the auction with her spine unbent but her heart unsettled, aware that admiration without courage was merely another form of abandonment. If he intended to wed Margaret Densmore, then his gestures toward her were indulgences best extinguished. A gust of wind rattled the infirmary windows as the door opened to admit a tall figure cloaked in rain. Water darkened the shoulders of Adrian Carlisle's coat, and his hat brim cast his expression in shadow until he removed it. He did not belong in such a place. His boots were too finely made, his posture too accustomed to command. Yet he crossed the threshold without hesitation, scanning the ward until his gaze found her. Eleanor stilled, though her hands remained steady upon the folded linens she carried. She dismissed the young nurse beside her with a quiet instruction and approached him, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Sir," she said evenly, the title deliberate, "this establishment is not designed for social calls." "I am not here socially," he replied, his voice lower than usual, stripped of public resonance. "I am here because silence has done greater damage than speech." The rain intensified, drumming against the panes like impatient knuckles. Eleanor regarded him with measured composure, noting the tension in his jaw, the faint crease between his brows that industry had never etched there before. "You permitted an announcement to stand unchallenged," she said. "Society heard consent. Society heard presumption," he countered. "I offered none." The words hung between them, insufficient yet necessary. He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "My mother has long cultivated an alliance with the Densmores. Margaret's confidence was anticipatory. I have not proposed." Eleanor absorbed this without visible relief. "Then you allowed me to stand beneath speculation for the sake of convenience," she replied. "You defended your ambition, then your reputation, but not once my name." He flinched, the smallest fracture in an otherwise disciplined facade. "I believed restraint would spare you further scrutiny," he said. "Instead, it appears I misjudged both society and myself." A patient coughed nearby, a stark reminder of the room's true purpose. Eleanor lowered her voice. You misjudged the cost of humiliation, she said. It does not dissipate because a gentleman feels regret. For a moment, he seemed to search for language unpracticed in negotiation rooms. When I spoke at the ball, he began slowly, I believed I was safeguarding my future. I see now that I was safeguarding my pride. There is a difference, and I discovered it too late. Her breath caught despite herself. The confession did not erase the wound, yet it illuminated its source. Why speak now? She asked. Because I find that every advantage I possess feels diminished by your absence, he answered, the admission unvarnished. You accuse me of silence. I have come to remedy it. I will publicly correct Margaret's claim. I will state plainly that my regard lies elsewhere. The word regard resonated, cautious yet profound. Eleanor's composure wavered by a single degree. Do not attempt gallantry on my behalf, she said softly. I require honesty, not rescue. Then honesty, he replied. I feared the depth of my feeling for you. To align myself with you after your father's losses would have been interpreted as folly. I chose safety. In doing so, I forfeited integrity. The infirmary seemed to contract around them, the storm outside mirroring the tumult within. Eleanor set the linens aside, folding her hands to steady them. Affection that trembles before gossip is not sturdy enough to bear marriage, she said. I will not be an experiment in your courage. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet case rain-dampened at the edges. Opening it revealed a ring set with a single sapphire, its blue echoing the shade of her gown on that disastrous evening. Gaslight caught the stone, igniting it with restrained fire. This is not a proposal, he said quickly. It is a promise that I will return to you having spoken truth, regardless of consequence. The gesture was intimate, perilous, and achingly sincere. Eleanor felt the pull of possibility, the dangerous warmth of hope. Yet she closed the case gently and pressed it back into his hand. Do not offer me fragments of bravery, she murmured. Return when you have chosen fully, not when you are rehearsing choice. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, an electric contact neither acknowledged. The space between them vibrated with what remained unsaid. At last, Adrian inclined his head, not in superiority but in solemn acknowledgement. Very well, he said. I will choose. He replaced his hat, rain reclaiming his shoulders as he stepped toward the door. Eleanor watched him depart, uncertain whether she had fortified her heart or endangered it further. The storm began to ebb, leaving the city washed and fragile. She turned back to her patients, determined to anchor herself in tangible service rather than speculative futures. An hour later, as dusk bled into the ward's dim corners, a messenger arrived breathless from the Whitcombe residence. Eleanor recognized the tremor in his voice before he spoke. Her father had been summoned to court at dawn. Creditors intended to press their claims without delay. The fragile equilibrium of her family's survival was fracturing. She closed her eyes briefly, the weight of new peril settling upon her shoulders. Adrian had promised to choose, but morning would demand decisions of its own, and she did not know whether his declaration would arrive in time to alter the course already set in motion. Dawn arrived without mercy, its pale light seeping through the thin curtains of the Whitcombe residence like an unwelcome witness. Eleanor had not slept. She sat beside the cold hearth, fully dressed, listening to the measured tread of her father's steps as he prepared for court. Each sound, the click of cufflinks, the quiet clearing of his throat, felt magnified by the knowledge that the day might dismantle what remained of their fragile standing. Debt was not merely financial, it was a public exposure, a stripping away of privacy and pride. Her father paused before her, attempting a reassuring smile that failed to disguise fatigue. It will be procedural, he said gently. A formality more than a spectacle. Eleanor rose and adjusted the knot of his cravat with steady hands. You taught me never to confuse hope with certainty, she replied. Allow me at least the dignity of preparation. They shared a silence dense with unspoken fear. When he departed, the door's soft closing sounded too final. Across the city, Adrian Carlisle stood in his mother's drawing room beneath portraits of unsmiling ancestors who had built their fortune upon decisive action. Lady Carlisle regarded her son with thinly veiled impatience as he announced his intention to withdraw from any implied engagement to Margaret Densmore. You will humiliate us, she warned. You will appear capricious. Adrian met her gaze without wavering. I have already humiliated someone far less deserving, he answered. I will not compound the offense. News of the Whitcombe hearing circulated swiftly, carried by clerks and carriage drivers alike. The prospect of public proceedings infused the afternoon society gala with sharpened anticipation. It was to be held at the Densmore estate, an event long planned, now charged with new significance. Eleanor, though weary, resolved to attend. Absence would signal defeat, presence would assert resilience. She chose a gown of restrained elegance, the pale blue silk transformed by subtle alterations into something unmistakably deliberate rather than diminished. The Densmore ballroom glittered with strategic opulence. Chandeliers cascaded light upon polished floors, and arrangements of white lilies exhaled a sweetness that bordered on cloying. Conversations hushed as Eleanor entered, her composure rendering curiosity momentarily uncertain. Margaret Densmore, radiant in ivory satin, stood near the dais where musicians tuned their instruments. Adrian had not yet arrived. Speculation fluttered like restless birds along the walls. Whispers thickened when a messenger was seen delivering a document to Lady Carlisle near the entrance. Eleanor's pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene. She knew the hearing had concluded by now. The outcome hovered invisibly above the room. If judgment had gone against her father, seizure of their remaining property would follow. The ballroom's splendor felt suddenly brittle, as though one decisive word might shatter its illusions. The doors opened with ceremonial precision, admitting Adrian. He wore black evening attire that rendered his features stark and resolute. Conversation ceased entirely. He crossed the room not toward Margaret, but toward the musicians' platform. The audacity of the gesture rippled outward. Lady Carlisle's fan stilled mid-motion. Margaret's smile faltered. Adrian raised a hand, requesting attention without flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying with controlled authority, "I must correct a presumption that has circulated under my silence." The word struck the air like a match. Margaret stepped forward, poised yet pale. "Surely this is unnecessary," she murmured, but he did not look at her. "It has been suggested," he continued, "that I have pledged myself in marriage to Miss Densmore. I have offered no such pledge." A collective intake of breath swept the hall. Margaret's composure cracked, though she recovered swiftly, chin lifting in defiance. Adrian pressed on, each syllable deliberate. "Moreover, I spoke recently in a manner unworthy of a gentleman, impugning the suitability of a lady whose integrity exceeds my own." Every gaze pivoted toward Eleanor. Heat surged beneath her skin, yet she did not retreat. Adrian descended from the platform and approached her, the distance between them collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. "Miss Whitcombe," he said loud enough for all to hear, "I declare that you would burden a man's standing. I have since discovered that it is I who have been diminished by pride. If you will permit me, I wish to amend that declaration before those who heard it." The room seemed suspended between heartbeat and echo. Eleanor felt the magnitude of the moment pressing against her ribs. This was the courage she had demanded, yet it arrived entwined with spectacle. "Amendment does not erase injury," she replied evenly. "What, precisely, do you intend to restore?" "Your honor," he answered without hesitation. "And, if you will allow it, my future." He turned to the assembly once more. "A gentleman's worth is not measured by wealth or lineage, but by the constancy with which he defends what he values. I value Miss Whitcombe above all advantageous alliances." The declaration was unmistakable. Lady Carlisle's face hardened. Margaret's eyes shimmered with furious humiliation. Murmurs swelled, some admiring, others scandalized. Adrian extended his hand toward Eleanor, not grasping, merely offering. "I ask you," he said, voice steady though quieter now, "to consider becoming my wife, not as an act of charity nor rebellion but of choice." The silence that followed carried a different quality, less voyeuristic, more reverent. Eleanor studied him, searching for any trace of hesitation. She saw none. Yet beneath the triumph of his defiance lay another truth. Her father's fate remained uncertain, their household precarious. To accept now might appear transactional, a rescue disguised as romance. She placed her hand lightly within his, then withdrew it with measured grace. "You have spoken bravely tonight," she said, audible to all. "But bravery discovered under threat is not yet steadfast. I will not be chosen because adversity has rendered me convenient to defend." Gasps scattered through the hall like startled birds. Adrian's expression did not harden. It softened as though he had anticipated resistance and respected it. "Then I shall prove steadfastness," he replied quietly. "Not with words but with action." Before Eleanor could answer, Lady Carlisle stepped forward, pale and rigid. In her hand trembled the document delivered earlier. "The Whitcombe estate," she announced with chilling clarity, "has been ordered into immediate review pending seizure." The words detonated across the ballroom. Eleanor felt the floor tilt once more, the past threatening to repeat itself in cruel symmetry. Adrian tightened his jaw, comprehension dawning. The battle for dignity had shifted from reputation to survival. As murmurs rose into chaos and Margaret retreated in wounded pride, Eleanor stood poised at the center of converging crises. Adrian leaned closer, his voice urgent but controlled. "Whatever this decree intends," he murmured, "I will not stand aside again." And in his eyes she saw not merely resolve, but a readiness to sacrifice the very empire that had once dictated his silence. The decree moved through London with the efficiency of scandal, attaching itself to the Whitcombe name like a brand. By morning, discreet condolences had replaced open curiosity, and tradesmen who had once extended polite credit now bowed with careful distance. Within the drawing room that had sheltered her childhood laughter, Eleanor stood beside her father as officials catalogued furnishings with gloved indifference. Each item recorded felt like a subtraction from memory. Yet she did not plead, nor did she weep. She listened, observed, and committed the humiliation to a quiet ledger within her heart. Her father's shoulders bore a new stoop, not of age but of defeat. "I miscalculated," he confessed in a low voice when the officials withdrew to confer. "I believed recovery possible." Eleanor took his hand, steadying him as she had once been steadied. "Then let us miscalculate no further," she replied. "We shall endure what remains." The words were firm, though she knew endurance would require departure. A governess position abroad had been offered through charitable connections, respectable, distant, and free from London's appetite for spectacle. She resolved to accept. Adrian learned of the seizure before the afternoon had waned. The news struck him not as surprise but as indictment. He had vowed not to stand aside again. Now circumstance demanded the cost of that vow. Within his study, contracts lay awaiting his signature, investments poised to expand his influence. Instead, he summoned his solicitor and issued instructions that would redirect substantial capital toward the anonymous purchase of Whitcombe debts. "Discretion is imperative," he said. "There must be no appearance of rescue." The solicitor hesitated, aware of the sum involved. Adrian did not. Yet money alone could not repair what pride had fractured. He understood that intervention unseen might stabilize her household but would not alter her resolve to depart. When he arrived at the Whitcombe residence, carriage wheels grinding over gravel soon to belong to another, he found the rooms partially stripped. Crates stood open like silent accusations. Eleanor knelt beside one, folding garments with measured precision. She rose at his entrance, her composure unshaken though the air between them throbbed with unfinished declarations. "You have come to witness the conclusion," she said gently. "It is efficient at least." "I have come to prevent it," he answered. She regarded him steadily. Prevention would have been valuable weeks ago. He accepted the rebuke without defense. "The debts have been acquired," he said. "Your father's obligations are satisfied. The review will dissolve." Understanding flickered across her features, followed by something more complex than gratitude. "At what cost?" she asked. "At mine," he replied simply. "A fraction of what I possess." "And what do you believe I possess, Mr. Carlisle?" she pressed. "Strength," he said. "Integrity. The rare capacity to confront humiliation without surrendering self-respect. I once mistook those qualities for liabilities. I was wrong." Silence stretched between them, not hostile but searching. She closed the lid of the crate and stepped closer, though not within reach. "You mistake the matter still," she said softly. "This is not about solvency. It is about soil." He frowned slightly. "Soil?" She inclined her head. "Love cannot flourish in ground salted with shame. You declared me unfit before those who measure worth as spectacle. You have since spoken bravely, even nobly. But the memory remains." He felt the truth of it settle with uncomfortable weight. "Then tell me how to cleanse it," he urged. "Name the penance." "You cannot erase what was said," she replied. "Nor should you attempt to purchase absolution. I will not tether myself to a man whose affection required catastrophe to ripen." He stepped nearer despite himself. "It did not require catastrophe," he said, voice low but fervent. "It required clarity. I saw what I valued only when confronted with its absence. That is not convenience, it is awakening." Her gaze faltered for the first time. "Awakenings do not guarantee constancy," she murmured. Outside, a carriage arrived to convey her to the docks. The sound tightened the moment, compressing possibility into urgency. Adrian drew a breath that felt like surrender and resolve intertwined. "If you depart," he said carefully, "you will do so believing I defended you out of impulse. I ask only the chance to prove endurance. And how would you prove it? She asked. By following, he answered. The simplicity of the declaration startled them both. He continued before doubt could reclaim him. Not to claim you against your will, but to remain present in whatever life you choose. I will build elsewhere if necessary. I will relinquish alliances that compromise your dignity. I will demonstrate that my regard is not reaction, but conviction. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. To be pursued not as ornament but as equal, such a prospect was both intoxicating and perilous. She thought of her father, whose eyes had regained a flicker of hope upon hearing the debts were settled. She thought of the ballroom, of whispers that had reduced her to a calculation. And she thought of the man before her, no longer armored in certainty, but standing exposed in deliberate humility. You would abandon London's advantage? She asked quietly. I would redefine it, he replied. Advantage without honor is impoverishment. The carriage door outside closed with a decisive thud. Time narrowed. Eleanor moved toward the threshold, Adrian following. At the steps she paused, the wind catching a loose strand of her hair. If I remain, she said, turning to face him fully, it will not be because you rescued us. It will be because I believe you have learned to stand beside rather than above. He met her gaze without flinching. Then test me, he said. Demand constancy. Demand partnership. I will not retreat. The driver cleared his throat, awaiting instruction. Eleanor looked from the carriage to Adrian, measuring not his wealth nor his defiance, but the steadiness in his eyes. Slowly she lifted her hand, not to accept possession but to establish accord. Very well, she said, voice firm though soft. We begin not with spectacle, but with patience. Relief and determination crossed his features in equal measure. He did not seize her hand. He clasped it as one might clasp an oath. Behind them, the Whitcombe house stood battered yet unclaimed, its future altered by sacrifice freely chosen. Before them stretched uncertainty unmarred by pride. As the carriage rolled away empty and the autumn light shifted from pale to gold, Eleanor understood that the true restoration had not been financial but moral. Adrian had risked reputation, alliance, and fortune to rectify a single sentence spoken in arrogance. Whether that courage would endure remained to be seen, but it had been born not of spectacle but of conscience. And in that fragile, luminous space between injury and forgiveness, they stepped forward together, not redeemed by society but redefined by choice.